All right, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me through the mic? Okay, good. Welcome. My name is Scott Latterman. I'm a member of the History Department at UMD. I am not Cindy Christian, the director of the Allworth Institute, which is sponsoring this event. Cindy, unfortunately, wasn't able to be here tonight. She sends her regrets. She wanted to be here to introduce and to welcome Dr. Hixson, but I'll be doing that in her stead. Before I introduce Dr. Hixson, I wanted to just let you know the format for tonight's evening. Walter Hixson is going to speak for roughly 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers after that. Before we get started, and recognizing that yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, I wanted to read UMD's land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Duluth is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on land that was cared for and called home by the Ojibwe people, before them the Dakota and Northern Cheyenne people, and other Native peoples from time immemorial. Ceded by the Ojibwe in an 1854 treaty, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. We recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and will work to hold the University of Minnesota Duluth accountable to American Indian peoples and nations. So I think that seems fitting, both given that yesterday was International Peoples Day, but also given the topic of tonight's talk. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Walter Hixson. Walter Hixson is Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Akron and was for some years a contributing editor and columnist for the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. He's twice been a Fulbright scholar in Russia in the last days of the Soviet Union, as well as in China in 2009. And he's the author of 11 books, including The Myth of American Diplomacy, National Identity, and U.S. Foreign Policy, Parting the Curtain, Propaganda, Culture, and the Cold War, 1945 to 1961, and George F. Kennan, Cold War Iconoclast, which won the Bernath Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. Most relevant to tonight's talk are two recent books of his. The first, Israel's Armor, The Israel Lobby, and the First Generation of the Palestine Conflict, which was published in 2019, and Architects of Repression, How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of U.S. Middle East Policy, which he published in 2021. So it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Hixson to UMD. Please join me in welcoming him here.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. Scott's a fine historian, and so it's always good to rendezvous with him, and I certainly appreciate Cindy Christian and the Allworth Institute for facilitating my appearance here. It's great to be back in Duluth. I was here in, 1974, heading up to the Boundary Waters canoe area, so I have some fuzzy memories, but what a beautiful town. I've enjoyed walking around, and I've been dining very well, thanks to Scott and friends. So tonight, we had no idea, of course, how timely this sort of discussion would be with what's going on, this difficult and tragic and horrific things that are happening in the region that we're going to address here. We don't know what's going to happen. We didn't know this was going to happen. Historians can't predict the future. What history can do is help you understand things when they happen. And I think that's the case, and I hope that's the case. And tonight, I hope I can help you with some of you, and you can help me in the Q&A with that, because certainly history is very important to understanding what's happening there today. So Scott did the invocation about the indigenous people of this region, something that's done pretty commonly in Canada, less so here, but UMD has a pretty progressive statement there. And that is a nice segue for us because it brings to mind one of the major interpretive themes of the Israel-Palestine issue in the last decade or so that I've been part of emphasizing, and that's settler colonialism. So traditional colonialism, you know about, I'm sure, it's British or English or French, whatever, going abroad, exploiting what we now call third world countries for profit, coming back home. Settler colonialism is different. Settler colonialism is the displacement of indigenous people by those who wish and desire and work to create new homelands of their own. So they're permanent settlements. They create facts on the ground and conduct removal policies. This should sound a lot like American history, because it is. The United States is a settler colonizing country. It was founded in the removal of the indigenous people from the land and the permanent settlement by the invaders that went on to become the United States of America. And this is one reason the United States and Israel have such close relations, is they're both what I term congenitally aggressive settler societies. So that's one thing, but Israel is distinct. And so what I want to do is talk about Israel and its evolution, the Israel-Palestine conflict, the American role in that, and then kind of bring it to a head at the present, and we can discuss what's going on now or the history, whatever you want. What distinguished Israel from other settler societies, be it the United States, Australia is another continental-wide ethnic cleansing society, settler colonization took place there. These settler colonies were created in the 19th century. Whereas Israel, of course, was founded formally in 1948. The Zionist movement culminated in the founding of Israel as a modern state and recognition by the UN, the partition of the British Mandate of Palestine. So there are two things that make Israel distinctive, settler colonial nation. So I'm saying that in some respects, Israel fits into a broader narrative of settler colonialism, a broader narrative of global history. But there are two ways it's very distinct. One is the impact of the horrific Nazi genocide. Obviously, this fueled the Zionist movement, fueled the fervor of Zionism, and the settler project in Israel had a special intensity flowing from not just the Nazi genocide, but centuries of anti-Semitism and repression of Jews really across the globe. The second distinctive feature of Israeli settler colonialism is the temporal one, and that is when it occurred, in the 20th century. After that same Nazi genocide inspired the world to create the United Nations, and of course the broader World War II, creation of the United Nations, Declaration of Universal Human Rights. So Israel was founded in a time when the world was attempting to transition from this very violent convulsion of World War II and the horror of the Nazi genocide and militarism and slaughter of innocents across the world in the global conflict, to a world order that would be characterized more by justice and human rights. And this is a problem for Israel because the settler colonial project entailed removal of the indigenous people, removal and ethnic cleansing policies, driving them out. And this was done in a major way in 1947-48 in the Nakba, as the Palestinians call it, the mass expulsion of Palestinian people from Palestine. Some 750,000 were driven out. And incidentally, about 70% of the population of Gaza today are from families and their descendants who were driven out in that Nakba of 1940, in the 1947 war in 1948. So this very violent, aggressive displacement, which I argue inheres in Israeli identity, as it did in the United States, as it did in Australia, but happening when it did in the 20th century was very different than happening in the 19th century. And this partly explains the focus on the lobby and the significance of the Israel lobby. There's, to put it bluntly, a big public relations problem here that has to be managed when this is being conducted, these operations, and this process being carried out precisely at the same time that the world community is creating the United Nations organization and renouncing these practices and extolling human rights. So this, I argue, and it's probably the most original part of my book, Architects of Repression, is one thing that distinguishes Israel from other settler societies is the need for this intense propaganda in order to address the problem of conducting these sorts of operations and a long-term occupation and various other activities that we'll talk about at a time when the world community had transitioned in a different direction. That's distinctive to Israel. So after the Nakba, there's the creation of Israel. This is a very well-known map. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it before, and it looks at the stages of what's happened here. And you can see 1946. This is the British Mandate of Palestine, all green. And what happened with 1947, when the UN did recognize Israel, and it was brought into the international order legally under the UN auspices, not certainly to the displeasure of the Palestinians and Arab states all around Israel, opposed this. But it did pass in the UN, and you can see this is the division of the former British Mandate of Palestine, and what's left of Palestine is a good green chunk, including Gaza. And you'll see the separation of Gaza by the 1967 war. So there were a series of conflicts. So Israel's an aggressive settler colonial state. It's very aggressive about its borders. This situation of 1947 did not make intense Zionists like the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, happy. His attitude was, well, we'll take this because we can get it now. It's not what we want. We want the whole thing. We should have the whole thing. It should be a Jewish, Palestine should convert to being Israel, should have it all. But we'll settle for this now and see what happens. It's the best we can do now. But the point is, Zionism is a very emotional and intense movement. And it wasn't as if the attitude was, okay, we've got it now, we're happy. The attitude of many people was, we want the whole thing. And this is the chunk we can get now. There are a series of wars. We don't have time to go into all of them. Basically, Israel was very aggressive on its borders and initiated these conflicts, including the 1967 war. It may well be you have heard that Israel was surrounded and threatened. It certainly, there was plenty of hostility toward Israel. There's no doubt about that. And plenty of Arab people saying it's an illegitimate state, even saying it should be driven into the sea, et cetera, et cetera. So it certainly was surrounded by enemies. But Israel initiated these conflicts, including the 1967 war. And I didn't know this until I started studying this. What you can often read is that Israel had no choice but to go to war. It had plenty of choice. And in fact, Arab diplomats were pleading with Washington to hold Israel back in 1967. But it launched the war and exploited the war, which it won handily, to expand its territory. And this gave rise to the occupation. And Palestine is under occupation from this moment until today. In other words, unlike the UN recognition, this is not legitimate in the eyes of the world. It is not recognized as legitimate Israeli territory. It's rather occupied territory, and there are various rules of law that apply it to an occupation. But Israel didn't view it that way. It held on to the Sinai Peninsula after this 1967 war, and Egypt in 1973, a conflict that's been alluded to here in recent days because it also occurred on a Jewish holiday in October of 1973, 50 years ago, and this wasn't lost on Hamas either, the date and the anniversary, if you will. And that resulted in a movement toward a peace settlement, an effort to bring peace that Jimmy Carter, among others, tried heartily to achieve. What they achieved was peace between Egypt and Israel. What they didn't achieve was a resolution of the Palestinian conflict. The occupation continued, the repression, often very brutal, of Palestinian people, police repression, incarceration, shootings, all manner of aggressive settler tactics by the Israeli state. The peace process was never taken seriously by Menachem Begin. What was supposed to be happening was that this was supposed to be the first step toward a comprehensive peace. But the real history is that the Zionist movement became increasingly fervent, and from the get-go, there was enough of a consensus to not make a peace settlement. The peace process is mythical. There was never a meaningful peace process that was going to resolve this. There could have been a two-state solution in theory, but it was Israel that would not do this, would not negotiate a two-state solution. It would sometimes talk the talk, but not walk the walk. So 1980s, there's a very intensive Israeli assault on Lebanon, southern Lebanon, part of ongoing border conflicts. This is a very vicious assault. There was mass killing, the kind of things you're watching on your television now about Hamas perpetrating, were done at the Shatila and Sabra refugee camps in southern Lebanon. I've visited these camps and the squalor and the horror in which people are forced to live. These are Palestinian refugees in southern Lebanon who were forced into southern Lebanon and live in these camps. And because there was the threat of attacks on Israel and episodic border crossing events, Begin launched an invasion led by Ariel Sharon, a particularly vicious general and later prime minister, and there were massacres perpetrated. And this gave rise, I know we're covering a lot of ground here, and you want to follow up with questions, you can. This gave rise to Hezbollah. And if you're watching your televisions these days, you're hearing about, will Hezbollah intervene in this particular conflict that's going on right now? Will it become a wider war? Hezbollah is armed and supported by Iran, so conceivably we could have a very broad and very ugly and very intensive Middle East conflict. I'm not saying that's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen. Remember, historians can tell you what's happened. They're not real great at telling you what's going to happen, and usually they know better than to try. So that was a black eye for Israel. There was a lot of international condemnation of the Lebanese intervention. And also a very popular and very pro-Israeli president, Ronald Reagan, also wanted to cultivate Arab allies, particularly in the Cold War context against the Soviet Union. That included Saudi Arabia, and the United States sold AWAC defense systems, Boeing aircraft defense technology, to Saudi Arabia. This angered the Israelis greatly. The Saudis then, unlike today, were vicious opponents or intense opponents of Israel. Today, particularly under Trump, there's been an effort to bring peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and that's probably been blown up by this conflict, but again, who knows what will happen. So this is when the lobby lost that battle. It lost very few battles over the years, but lost that one and intensified its propaganda and advocacy. So let's back up now and talk about that. That's a quick run through Israeli expansion, which you can see on the map, and I've characterized it in a settler colonial context. So the lobby that I've studied intensely really begins much earlier than this in the 1980s. It begins with the status of Jewish refugees. So after World War II, there were a lot of Jewish refugees in various places who'd been driven out by the Nazi Holocaust and fled for their lives, and now wanted to come to the new homeland for the Jews that the Zionist movement, which originally had called for at the turn of the century, but became a reality after the Nazi genocide. And the United States was the country with the largest Jewish population in the world. So more Jews lived in the United States than in the new Israel at that time. And the United States has the second largest Jewish population, not much under Israel. I don't know the exact figures today. So New York City was really the homeland of international Jewish Zionist movement. And there was then, and because of this shared settler colonial identity, the United States was a somewhat natural supporter of Israel. Also, the United States hadn't done a whole lot about Nazi genocide against the Jews. You can debate what it could have done. The argument was just the best thing we can do is win the war as fast as possible. But other things might have been done. They weren't done. So there's a certain amount of guilt maybe involved in the U.S. support for Israel. So some advocates appealed to the Congress to fund the Jewish refugees relocating to Israel. And they wrote letters to their congressmen, had people, Jewish federations, Jewish groups call people in Congress to get their support, and they won that effort and ultimately won Harry Truman's decision to recognize the new Israel and propel its acceptance by the global community. So in other words, this early lobbying for bringing refugees to the Zionist homeland worked. And this was a light bulb moment for these Zionist advocates that became the Israel lobby. And the lobby grew in the 1950s. They created a newsletter that was circulated throughout the Congress called the Near East Report. They continued the phone calls, letter writing. There were a variety of organizations. AIPAC is the largest one. We'll talk about more. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee is the essence of the Israel lobby. It's by far and away the largest lobby advocating the interests of a foreign country in all of American history. Not even close. It's in fact one of the most powerful lobbies in America, period. It's right up there with the gun, elderly persons, and pharmaceutical lobbies. It's a very powerful lobby for a foreign country of 9 million people, the state of Israel. And the lobby, AIPAC worked with a group called the Congress of the Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, worked with a lot of local Jewish federations. So they're all manner, way too many to even know or name, and working in concert with Israel. You know, women's groups, student groups, all kinds of Israeli advocacy groups that formulate the lobby. So it's not just AIPAC. AIPAC is the centerpiece of the lobby. And so that's the story. It's a very powerful, very effective lobby. Though a lot of people deny that, it's palpably clear that it is a powerful and effective lobby. So you're seeing it in action today. We'll talk more about what's going on today if you want. But the talking points you're hearing, not to deny that horrific things are happening. They're clearly horrific things have happened. But if any of you, I recommended this today at lunch, and some of the folks we had lunch with had already seen it. But if you get a chance, see the film, The Occupation of the American Mind. It will let you know how the lobby works and how Israeli talking points become hegemonic, dominant in discourse in the United States. In other words, what we hear is Israel's side of affairs. Pretty much 98% pro-Israel discourse in the United States, and very little on the Palestinian side of this. And that's the work of the lobby. That's what they do. And they're very, very good at it, and have been for a long time. These are smart people. They're well-funded, mostly by a handful of Orthodox, extremely wealthy Jewish donors. This is not to say that all American Jews are pro-Israeli, although there was a lot of cultural work done. Jewish Americans were raised to support Israel. There's no question about that. Most of them did support Israel. Most of them do today support Israel, particularly at times like this. But there are a lot of, Jews are traditionally a pretty liberal group in their voting record and the kind of issues they support. And most are not Orthodox, although the Orthodox, because they have a lot of children, are growing faster than the Reform Judaism community. And under Trump, they were very influential because his son-in-law was one of them, and they made a lot of progress in their view at that time. So the result of this powerful lobby is that Israel gets its way with the United States Congress. I can't even put this in too strong a terms. I'll say AIPAC owns the U.S. Congress. It flat out owns it. The U.S. Congress does what AIPAC wants it to do. Because if they don't, they will fund your opponent in the next election. They will charge you with being an enemy of Israel. Even anti-Semitism these days, the charges know virtually no bounds. Some vicious attacks. Your own Minnesota representative, Betty McConnell, was charged with being anti-Semitic. Why? Well, she sponsored a bill to denounce Israeli imprisonment of children, Palestinian children, which they do. That the U.S. would not support Israel financially if it continued to jail children. She called AIPAC a hate group, and you can make that argument certainly. So through its funding, through its propaganda efforts, AIPAC dominates the United States Congress. There's the AIPAC office building. So, it exists, and probably about 300 people work there. And they have millions of dollars that they expend on a variety of things: publications, films, attacks on professors like me, lots of things. But mostly they've been centered since that early period when it was the issue of the refugees on getting what they want from the U.S. Congress. And Israel does get what it wants from the U.S. Congress. It gets $3.8 billion a year from the U.S. Congress. That's in a 10-year agreement. It gets a lot more than that. There's various dark money and other funds, and then things like this happen, and they pump more money in. The United States is right now getting ready to give Israel what it wants militarily and financially. Since World War II, Israel's received about $150 billion from the United States. This is by far more than any other country in the world. Now here we have a little country of 9 million people that's highly developed. Israel's of course been there, and many of you have, I know. It's like a little European Mediterranean country. It's highly developed. It's a nice place to visit if you're not a Palestinian, and it doesn't need the money. It doesn't need the money militarily. It's by far the military powerhouse of the Middle East region. But it keeps getting it. It keeps getting it, and this is a result of AIPAC and the lobby. All right, let's see. What time is it? I got about 10 or 15 more minutes, and then I'll shut up, at least until you ask questions or try to straighten me out. Let's talk about Gaza a little bit then, since that's obviously happening now. Let me say one more thing about the importance of the United States and the lobby. So again, the occupation of this, so you see what's happened by 2012. And this is a very important part of this that has to be explained. Because I mentioned Ben-Gurion's attitude, we got this now, we'll take what we get now, but we want more. That attitude was widely shared, and settlers in Israel, this is where the settler colonialism is an ongoing organic process. Settlers expanded into these new territories. So the area, the growing white on the map here, is the disintegration of Palestine, disappearing Palestine through Jewish settlements. All of these are illegal. Again, your map in 1947, that's legal. The UN recognized Israel in the partition of Palestine. Everything else is illegal. Occupations are not supposed to be permanent, and settlers are not supposed to be taking new land. And they have taken new land to this tune that you see on the map, and it's even grown more since then. About 700,000 plus Jewish settlers have moved onto Palestinian land and driven Palestinians off. So we see the horrible things Hamas is doing, and I have no intention of saying that they aren't horrible. Israel's done horrible things in the occupied territories for many years, and particularly in Gaza, as a matter of fact. But driving people out of their homes, demolishing homes, incarcerating people, shooting people, this has all been done again and again and again in the occupied territories. It spurred some things you might have heard of. The Intifada in 1987 was an effort, unlike what Hamas has done, to peacefully resist and bring a certain Martin Luther King-style change, brutally repressed. Second Intifada in 2000, brutally repressed. Israel has been a repressive, brutal, militarist occupying power. I know it might sound like harsh language. Sorry, it's reality. That's been done. And this is the result. So all these have been condemned by the UN. There's all sorts of votes in the UN denouncing these illegal Jewish settlements. And they usually are by votes of 150 to 2, for example, with only the United States and Israel voting against this. Or 148 to 4. You throw in the Marshall Islands or some other U.S. Country that the U.S. funds. So this is not accepted by the international community. It's not legitimate, it's illegal, and it's very repressive. And this gives rise to the rage that you see on your television screens. You can't understand what's happening today if you start with October 7th. You are clueless and hopeless to understand what's happening if you think it started on October 7th. Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th. As Scott Latterman and many other know, including you all, a lot went on before December 7th. That didn't happen out of a vacuum either. So that's not the way history works. And so this history is vital for you to understand, to grasp and appreciate the horrific things that are happening today and are going to continue to happen. All right, so Gaza. Gaza is, I'll talk for about 10 more minutes and then turn it over to you folks. Gaza is about the size of Duluth. It's really about the size of Duluth. Scott looked it up. Greater Duluth is roughly 22 miles wide. I don't know about, or long, I don't know about wide.
26.
26, you'll go with that. So Gaza's 25 and 5 miles wide. What's the population of Duluth?
86,000.
86,000. What's the population of Gaza? 2.2 million.
Oh my God.
Yeah, just think about that. And among other things, think about the bombs going off there. And, right now Israel has said, get out. There's no place to go. It's blockaded. Israel withdrew from Gaza. So you see that it's green on the map. There were Israeli settlements in Gaza, but they were relatively few, not like the West Bank. So the West Bank is the area over here, the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's where the occupation resistance has gone on for years. Gaza, Sharon said, to hell with Gaza, just give it back to them and force the settlers to leave, which they were very unhappy about. So if you think there's going to be a two-state settlement, which has long been the goal, I would argue it's probably too late for that. There's just not enough of Palestine left. Look at it. It's not there anymore. How are you going to make a state out of that hodgepodge? And then there's all kinds of things we could talk about. There's checkpoints, roads, Jewish-only roads. If you go and visit, you can see the occupation and the brutality of it. It's not the way anybody would want to live, and they're certainly not free people. It has nothing to do with justice and human rights. So Gaza's small, but maybe the most densely populated place in the world, even more than Tokyo. And so what's going to happen to Gaza after they let it go? Well, Bush W. Wanted, after his brilliant invasion of Iraq, he touted free elections in Iraq. We're going to turn Iraq into a democracy. And so let's do this in Gaza too. Let's have elections. Well, it's a problem. Hamas won. They had free elections that were supervised by the international community. This was at a time when we recognized the results of free elections as being legitimate, not like today. But it was a legitimate election, and Hamas won. And this was unacceptable to the United States. So, okay, forget free elections. We're not for that after all, because the wrong guys won. And Israel viewed Hamas as purely a terrorist organization, which is very problematic. We could talk about if you wanted to. It's certainly engaging in terroristic activities now. There's no question about that. Calling it simply a terrorist bomb squad organization is too simplistic. Hamas has been willing to talk, and it's even said here in the last couple of days, you want to talk, we'll talk about the hostages. We can talk. But Netanyahu, believe me, the happiest guy in the world today, I'm lapsing into sarcasm, I can see that, but is Benjamin Netanyahu. He wants to unload on Gaza. He wants to kill Palestinians. He really does. He is, in my view, a certified war criminal with what he's done and what he has advocated. All right, so it's a small place. It's a vulnerable place. Israel blockaded it. That is, they control access to it, coming and going, both by sea and by land. There's an access to Egypt on the other side, and it's highly impoverished. It's hardly an independent, free country in any nature. Now, in recent years, and I'll finish up here, and we can turn it over to some discussion, a number of things have happened under Netanyahu, this intensely right-wing Israeli leader, and a corrupt leader, I might add. Many people feel like one reason Netanyahu is happy is this. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz today had a very sharp editorial saying that Netanyahu will exploit this for his own personal benefit to avoid. He's been charged with corruption and is supposed to be going to trial for that. What's happened? Well, so under the original UN plan, after the partition of Palestine, there was going to be a Palestinian state. Its capital would be at East Jerusalem, the eastern part of the Holy City. Instead, Israel is steadily cleansing East Jerusalem of Palestinians and taking it over. Israel has formally proclaimed itself a Jewish state. It's not a state with Jews and Palestinians, it's a Jewish state. It's a state for the Jewish people. Well, Palestinians live within Israel, and Palestinians are the majority, of course, of the occupied territories, although these settlers are streaming in ever-increasing numbers. If you're a Jewish state, you are an apartheid state. It's that simple. You can't be a Jewish state and a democratic state at the same time. If you want to be a democratic state, you have to be a state that's where all people are equal. If you're a Jewish state and certain rights and privileges are for Jewish people only, access to certain roads are Jewish people only, you're driving the non-Jewish people off their lands, taking their lands, shooting at them when they go to harvest their olive trees, incarcerating people without trial, beating, maiming, killing. They've done all that for decades. It's just reality. I'm not making it up. So this is what you won't hear on CNN or MSNBC and God knows Fox. You're not going to hear any of this. I've been watching, and I haven't heard precious little, although there have been a couple of references to Gaza as the world's largest outdoor prison, and that's an apt characterization. So all of this is enraging, and what you see is rage by Hamas. These are young people who are angry repressed, and violent. They've been mistreated. Their people have been mistreated. And now Netanyahu has moved to make it a permanent settlement. The attitude is, screw them. It's a Jewish state. We're taking the capital for ourselves. Too bad. And this is what you get. And that's where we are today and why we're where we are today. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions or comments any of you might have. Thank you.
I see you have a microphone. Okay, sure. We had a question over here.
Yeah, I'm pretty loud anyway. So pre-1946, okay, what was the Jewish population of Palestine, and what had happened before? You sort of started the world in 1946.
Yeah.
I'm just interested.
Well, so the Zionist movement is founded, as I mentioned, at the turn of the century. It's propounded a biblical holy land for the Jews. And they begin flocking there, but in relatively small numbers. And, you know, for a long period, there wasn't immediate violence. By the 1920s, there was an uprising. In the 1930s, an uprising. Violent conflict between Jewish settlers and Palestinians. So the violence gradually emerged as more and more Jews flocked to the area and began to displace or threaten, in the minds of indigenous people, their homelands. And so then the British tried to keep the lid on this. It was the UN gave, sorry, not the UN, in World War I, in the aftermath of World War I, there was the mandate system created, a neo-colonial system created in which the European powers would supervise other people's emergence into modern states. And that's when you get the creation of Syria, for example, and Lebanon. And the idea is that, so the British had this Palestinian mandate and an explosive situation with Jews and the indigenous people in increasing conflict. The British tried to keep a lid on it and incidentally were subjected to terrorism, including Menachem Begin, who was the architect of the bombing of the King David Hotel. Very few people know that the UN appointed mediator, a man named Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, was assassinated by Jewish terrorists. So the Zionists were terrorists as well to get their state and the foundation period of their state. So nobody's got a monopoly on terror or violence in this conflict. So that's what was happening. But what really made it take off was the 1930s and the Nazi genocide. Not the genocide, but the repression first and then the genocide later. So large numbers of Jews fled Europe. And it's not just the Germans, of course. Russia was probably the center of anti-Semitism for many decades, and where these stereotypes of Jews as, you know, these stereotypes which are still on the internet, which are ridiculous, of, you know, Rothschild, global conspiracy dominated by Jews, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. My question was, arguably,
I can hear him. It's fine.
arguably, back in biblical times, there were a lot of Jews in Palestine and the Israel area. Can't they predate their existence in that territory back past 46? I mean, and this diaspora, in that argument there. Whatever, what was the Balfour Declaration?
Yeah, the Balfour Declaration was British support for a Jewish homeland. And that was a very significant event when Britain declared it would support the creation of a Jewish homeland. 17, right? Balfour Declaration. So the answer, you know, I'm not a biblical scholar, but actually I realized, you know, you needed to do some of that, and I did. And in the appendix to Architects of Repression, there's a discussion of this. Of course, yes, Jews existed in ancient times. So did Palestinians. And Jews, in fact, so the Bible, for example, juxtaposes Jews and Canaanites. And in fact, these are the same people. So this ethnic difference is mythical. And Jews were created out of the indigenous population of the, Jews are an imagined community. Christians are created themselves. United States doesn't exist. You can't touch the United States. This microphone you can touch, it's real. The United States, it's just something we made up, like all other countries. And that's what Jews are, and every religion is. It's a human construct. So no, there's not any area that was exclusively owned by Jews and thus is theirs and they should get it back. Now they make that argument all the time. It's not historically sound.
Yes. If anything, what do you think the U.S., either politically or your average American citizen, gains from such a close relationship with Israel?
Yeah, it's an argument that's often invoked. The world's a hard, nasty place. SHIT happens, you need allies. Israel's an important ally in the Middle East. We need to support it. So you hear that all the time. And I look at it and I go, well, what did they help us with? Well, let's see. Get into the Iraq War, get into the Afghan War. These have been disasters. So I don't see, I'm not saying you shouldn't have a relationship with Israel at all. We have a lot of affinity with Israel. The large Jewish populations of both countries are an important affinity. Israel should be an ally of the United States, but it should be an ally that pursues justice and abides by international law, not defies it contemptuously, and in a very nasty fashion denies people equality. And what I would, you asked me what I would do, or what I think we should do, and a lot of people have proposed that you make this, first of all, we should dramatically slash aid to Israel. It doesn't need it. There are a lot of countries that need it a lot more than Israel does. As I mentioned, and will reiterate, it's by far the most powerful military in the region. Every war, and I didn't mention about Gaza, so quickly let me state that there was a war, it's not even a war, it's just a massacre, in 2008, in 2014, in 2021. This is asymmetrical warfare. Israel is a modern militarized power. It's got military technology second to no one. If we get it, we give it to them. If we don't, they spy on it and get it. And so what do the Hamas have? It has crude rockets, which can do damage and can kill people, but not that many. It took them an invasion. And what these Hamas folks decided was, well, they think this system's ensconced and we're just going to put up with it forever. The rockets aren't doing it. We're going to invade and punish them and let them know we're not done. And that's what's happened here. But these wars that happen versus Gaza are just, shooting fish in a barrel. They're horrible because of it's so densely populated and modern weaponry and technology. It's happening right now, this instant when we're talking. They're blowing up buildings. And of course it's horrific that Hamas came in and killed babies and slaughtered people. Just now, a housing unit probably blew up in Gaza and killed babies and slaughtered people. You're not going to find it much on CNN or MSNBC. So the warfare has always been asymmetrical, a fancy word meaning Israel kills a lot more people than it suffers. If you look at any conflict that's happened in the region, and this one will be the same, it was 1,000 Israelis or 900, whatever it was. It's dreadful. It will be radically eclipsed by the number of dead Palestinians. Trust me on that one. I am predicting the future now. So yeah, make the relationship contingent on more adherence to international norms and human rights and justice, and make the money contingent on it. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Scott.
Hey, you made a comment earlier about how you thought it was inaccurate talk more about Hamas, like how it started and what it does?
Well, one of the aspects of how it started that a lot of people aren't aware of is Israel helped start it. Israel helped create its secret intelligence agencies, which are very active, of course, in the world. And Israel leads the world in another thing, and that's targeted assassinations. By far, Israel assassinates more people, whether it's scientists in Iran or they're a favored target. So they have assassination squads. They have a very capable intelligence entity. Anyway, they helped create Hamas in order to divide Palestinians. And your question raises this issue. So Hamas is centered in Gaza, and in the West Bank is governed, back to the Oslo Accords of 1993, it's ostensibly governed by the Palestinian Authority. So there are divisions, very sharp divisions among Palestinians. All Palestinians don't view things the same way. And certainly Hamas is way more radical than the Palestinian Authority. Most Palestinians, I'm comfortable in saying most, view the Palestinian Authority as a tool of Israeli repression. Money goes to the Palestinian Authority. Some people line their pockets. Its leader, Abbas, is very limited capability individual. Yasser Arafat was a very problematic individual. But to answer your question, certainly Hamas these are terroristic activities, if you want to call them that. I mean, I would call it resistance using terror tactics. It's resistance. Israel's now declared war, but it's been conducting war against the Palestinians for decades, as I've tried to explain. At various times, it's said it would talk. And the issue always comes up, well, Hamas won't recognize Israel. Well, Israel won't recognize Hamas. It won a free election and wasn't recognized. So, you can pursue diplomacy with anybody. And as I said, they have made the statement, we'll talk about the hostages. And instead, apparently, the hostages are going to die. I think it's a mistake for Hamas to do that. And certainly if they publicize executions and convert themselves more and more into an ISIS-like organization, it's not going to help them. And already, many more people are going to be killed because of this invasion. But you know what? They were just tired of taking it. And the powerlessness and the humiliation, especially men, want to be men and want to fight back, and that's what's done. So it's a little more flexible than just reducing it to a terroristic bomb squad, but it's certainly a radical. It's not as radical as ISIS, or hasn't been, or Daesh, I'm sorry, or what am I trying to think of?
Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda, thank you. That's exactly what I was trying to think of. And I hope they don't go completely in that direction, but there are some disturbing, especially if they parade hostages out and execute them. One thing that the Israelis are, that I've obviously emphasized here, are a lot better at is propaganda and depictions of things. And so they're pretty crude. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, up top.
So Gaza is like the most surveilled place in the world, and Israel certainly has the technology to possibly have foreseen this attack coming. And I think there's also evidence that Egypt warned them, 10 days prior that there's a possible impending attack. Is it appropriate to speculate that Israel just let this attack happen so that they could justify squashing Gaza?
It doesn't smell that way to me. You never know what we might find out in the future. I don't think so. I haven't seen any credible evidence of that. A lot of times people don't want to believe that these things happen. Well, 9/11 happened. Pearl Harbor happened. Surprise attacks happen. And looking back, it certainly was the case with Pearl Harbor. As Scott well knows, looking back, people said, relations with Japan had sharply deteriorated. They were very bad. We should have been better prepared and known this might happen. 9/11, Al-Qaeda had, bombed the USS Cole. It had tried to take out the World Trade Center before. It had conducted other operations. We should have been better prepared for that. I think this is the case with this. I think And it's you're right, it's heavily surveilled, but on the other hand, it's not that hard to hide these rockets. So Hezbollah has many rockets dug into southern Lebanon. Israel knows they're there, but other than carpet bombing Lebanon, and even then they'll just come back. That raises the question: what the hell is going to happen in Gaza? Are they going to kill everyone? Well, if not, then what? Israel's not going to take it back over. And this military operation, house-to-house fighting, we found out in Iraq, that's very difficult and very ugly and can go on a long, long time. So it's not clear what Israel wants to do other than really punish them. But I don't think that scenario you outlined is probably going to be what happened.
You mentioned earlier, with AIPAC and its influence on the government of the United States, and how you would be like, oh, if a congressman said, we should stop our aid to Israel and everything, they could just be like, well, then we're going to fund your opponent in your office.
Right.
Would you say in the future, Palestinians are eventually driven out of Israel? Could groups like AIPAC be looked at as a root cause of the U.S. not involving or being more involved in stemming a peace option or something?
Well, that's what I'm trying to argue with my work, and is that we need to recognize that a lot of what's going on is because of propaganda and disinformation. Here's a couple of fellows you might recognize. Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey, is a passionate advocate of African American equality, civil rights, human rights. He invokes Martin Luther King. He's very liberal. Comes to Israel, he's 100% pro-Israeli, 100,000%. He speaks eloquently for Israel and is unconcerned, apparently, about dark-skinned Palestinians. He speaks at AIPAC. He gets rewarded. He knows he'd be punished if he didn't. Story of Mitch McConnell is that he very narrowly won the 1984 election in Kentucky over the incumbent Democrat Dee Huddleston. AIPAC supported Huddleston because his votes were pretty good on Israel. So McConnell won narrowly. He went to AIPAC and he said, hey, what can I do to get your support in the future? And they said, Mitch, we like Republicans as well as Democrats. If you support the pro-Israeli position, you'll be rewarded. He did. He's received more money from AIPAC than any other politician in America, and became, of course, one of the most powerful power brokers in the Senate in all of its history. So, there are a few people, Rashida Tlaib, Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, that criticize and condemn Israeli repression. They are bitterly attacked, get death threats all the time. It's very hard. Their opponents have been funded, but their local people have kept them in office. But they're right now trying to recruit somebody they think can defeat Ilhan Omar, someone you all know, and that's what they do. So, yeah, I think it's appalling that again, it's by far and away the most powerful lobby advocating the interests of a foreign country in American history, and that they own our U.S. Congress, and they use money to dominate it. Since COVID, they haven't had this annual conference, but where they're speaking in Washington, AIPAC would have an annual conference, and senators and representatives would fall all over themselves to go to it and advocate for Israel in order to get the support and not get the opposition of the lobby.
Question here? Yep.
I was just going to say, we were in Israel in March, and we went to the Aida refugee camp in Bethlehem, where it's supposed to be the most tear-gassed place in the world. And that is the children who come out will occasionally throw a rock or something, and they're immediately tear-gassed. And those tear gas canisters are produced in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And our country doesn't know that.
Right. Well, there's long been campaigns against American corporations that fund Israeli repression. There was a long campaign against Caterpillar over the bulldozing of homes. Home demolitions has been a tactic. One way to get Palestinians out of the land you want is demolish their home. They can't live there anymore. And that's been a routine activity that has been done. There was a campaign against Caterpillar. In fact, a young American woman was mowed down by an Israeli-driven Caterpillar when she was protesting in Gaza. What was her name? Do you remember?
Rachel Corrie.
Rachel Corrie, thanks. It wasn't coming to my mind. Rachel Corrie from the state of Washington. You can look her up. She's, just a young woman who cared about the repression of Palestinians, and the witnesses believe she was deliberately killed in that attack. So your question gives rise to the issue of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And this movement is very much feared by Israel, that the movement to get countries to disinvest and boycott Israel over its repression of Palestinians, they have fervently attacked BDS, and they fervently attack supporters of BDS. And this is something relevant to you college students. I don't know if there's a Students for Justice in Palestine organization at UMD, but there are many around the country. And these are college students. And if they hold a meeting and protest, they're attacked. And what the lobby will do will be to call the chancellor or call a member of the Board of Regents or Board of Trustees, whatever it is in various states, and say, you've got these radical students that are anti-Semitic. You need to shut that down. And all they're doing is advocating for Palestinians. So they're equating opposition to Israeli repression with anti-Semitism. They're attacking free speech. As I write in my book, Israel is not content to take away, Israel and AIPAC, rights from Palestinians. They want to take rights away from Americans. They're attacking freedom of speech. They are. They're trying to shut it down and using those kind of tactics to try to get their way.
Yes. Are you familiar with the Clean Break report?
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about the relationship with the goals outlined in that memo and how that's influenced American foreign policy?
Yeah, so the Clean Break report, I wouldn't go too far with it, but it was a blueprint for basically Israeli domination of the region that was in part of the thinking of the Iraq War. It's certainly too strong, and I don't think say that Israel took us into the Iraq War. I don't think that's accurate. I think the trauma of 9/11 and the foolishness of the Bush administration and Rumsfeld and neocons led to that, and the rage of the American people, because the majority of people supported the war. I know. I spoke against it on a college campus and was hooted and booed and et cetera. People, and this is what's going to happen, of course, in Israel now and in the United States, is rallying around in the wake of this Hamas attack. But the idea is that Israel would dominate the region by eliminating its opponents like Iraq. It didn't drive U.S. foreign policy, but it is telling that such a blueprint was drawn up. Now it's become a little more sophisticated. The idea was to get Saudi Arabia, Kushner's initiative, the Abraham Accords, to get Saudi Arabia, Morocco, other countries to recognize Israel, and that's probably been blown up it's very hard for MBS or any leader of an Arab country to say, oh yeah, I'll do business with Israel when it's going to be pummeling the heck out of Gaza.
Kind of two things here. Besides ideological viewpoints, are the Israeli lobby and the Israeli government directly connected? And then the second part is, can you steelman the argument for an Israeli lobby in the United States?
Can you what?
Steelman? Give the best possible argument for the lobby in the United States?
You could make an argument for the lobby in the very early period. You could certainly make the argument that helping Jewish refugees go to a place where they could live in peace, you could defend that. I can't defend anything the lobby's done pretty much since then. Sorry, what was your first question?
Besides ideologically, are AIPAC and the Israeli state directly
Oh,
connected?
well, they're indirectly connected. They don't come out and announce, hey, we talk every day about what to do about the threat of BDS and about this and that, but there's no question that the Congress of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, AIPAC has an office in Jerusalem, so they're certainly connected. And there have been points. So, for example, when Rabin did the famous handshake with Arafat, AIPAC and Israeli right-wingers were opposed to that and opposed to the peace process. And of course, Rabin was assassinated by a Israeli terrorist, and the peace process, as I've described, is mythical anyway, didn't go anywhere. So there's no question they're connected. Your question directly is a little problematic, whether it's direct or indirect, but they're connected. AIPAC generally does what Israel wants it to do, and but that's only because the people in AIPAC genuinely side with Israel. It's not because they just take orders.
There's not just necessarily an order.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
An argument could be made maybe that there are many places on earth where there have been movements away from restrictive religious orientation of countries,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it happened in the United States, and we had William Penn, and he came up with the idea that maybe everybody's okay. And is there any hope here that at some point the light bulb goes off and they start to accept the fact that people can have different religions?
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a land conflict than a religion conflict, because as I'm sure you all know, many evangelical Christians are pro-Israel, and some of the most fervent even believe that Jews will be slaughtered when Jesus comes back. But Israel in the lobby, that's okay. We'll take your support anyway for now. We're not too worried about that. So, but it's more of a land conflict than a religious conflict. A lot of people don't know that, of course, there are people in this room who know because they've visited and talked with them, that there are Palestinian Christians. They're not all Muslim. There's a lot of Palestinian Christians, particularly around Bethlehem. But if I could extrapolate from your question as we wrap up here, sometimes I quip, I could settle the Israeli-Palestine conflict tomorrow, which sounds utterly fatuous. But if this was somehow we got to the point where this could be recognized as a one-state democracy, call it Israel-Palestine or call it Israel with autonomous areas for Palestinians, break down the checkpoints, the repression, the militarization, all that, one person, one vote. You have roughly 50-50 Palestinians and Jews. I really believe that what people would care about is what people care about. That's like making enough money for their families to live and to get ahead and to have decent lives and to have education. And that would replace this hatred. It could be done, but not when you're declaring, nope, it's a Jewish state, and embracing apartheid. And I can't emphasize that too much. And it was very significant that your own Minnesotan Thomas Friedman, the longtime pro-Israeli columnist from Minnesota, said, there's no denying Israel's an apartheid state. You can't be a democratic state and a Jewish supremacist state at the same time. Not possible. But I do believe if it was a democratic state, that it would, a one-state solution this is advocated by a number of people. It's certainly not my idea. I made the quip, but it's long been discussed. One man, Miko Peled, his father was a hero of the '67 war. He's a staunch critic of, and by the way, there's a lot of people, if you don't know, in Israel who oppose what, not so much today. You rally around the flag when this horrible kind of stuff happens. But there are probably more Israelis, percentage-wise, who oppose what Israel does than there are Americans. There's a lot of conflict in Israeli politics, particularly over Netanyahu. But he advocates the one-state solution. I'll tell you quickly about his sister, just because she's so inspiring to me. She's a historian. Her name is Nurit Peled Elhanan, and she wrote a book about how Israeli school books demonize Arabs. She's a historian. She studied the school books that are given to children and how they learn in Israel to have contempt for Arabs. And her 13-year-old daughter was blown up by a suicide bomber in the 1990s. And she said, we invented the suicide bombers. It's our fault. There wouldn't be suicide bombers. And that's a little bit how I feel about what's happening today. I don't condone what Hamas is doing, particularly the style in which they're doing it. I think they have every right to resist Israel. And, you know, they're an illegally occupied, repressed, blockaded. A blockade is an act of war. Israel's now formally declared war, but it's been making war on Gaza for a long time. So I think Hamas has a right to resist. I wouldn't have recommended that they act exactly the way they have, but they're enraged, as I said.
Okay, up top.
Is there a, you said that the politics in Israel is divided
Yeah.
deeply, especially when it comes to Netanyahu and the solutions that he's put forward for one-state Israel. Are there political parties within Israel that have a realistic shot of taking power and perhaps changing something when it comes to Palestinian policy?
There might have been a time when the Labor Party under Rabin, and you shouldn't get the impression that Rabin was Martin Luther King. He certainly wasn't, and been a defense minister and the architect of a lot of repression. But, you know, the United States did at various times, particularly Carter, Clinton, George H.W. Bush, in fact, tried to rein in Israeli settlements, and it was one of the reasons he lost for re-election. It's not the main reason, I don't think. But the lobby attacks presidents and State Department when they opposed, and very often there's no need for that. For example, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he's Jewish. It's not just that he's Jewish, but he's a longtime pro-Israeli Zionist. Negotiators of various treaties were pro-Zionist Jews.
I'm talking more specifically within Israel.
Yeah, I know you are. But no. Is the answer. There are some, you may not be aware, there are some Palestinians in the Knesset. There are Palestinians who live in Israel, and they do have voting rights. The people in the occupied territories do not. But Palestinians within Israel can vote, and they have a few representatives, but they're treated very badly and marginalized and hooted and condemned and et cetera. And they certainly have no chance to come to power. But no, the peace faction has been pretty well eroded. And the anger at Netanyahu, I didn't want to give the impression, is over his repression of Palestinians. That's true of some people, but there's also a whole array of domestic policies and the corruption that generate opposition to him. One or two more, maybe?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Our last question.
All right, well, peace and love.
All right.